Hey, welcome to The Conversation. My name is Kyle, and I'm coming to you from the First Colony Church of Christ in Sugar Land, Texas. I'm glad that you're here. Welcome. This is week 2 in our teaching series called Margin. We're talking about this because margin is the space where faith grows. Margin is the space where faith grows. Last week, in our first week of our Conversation teaching series, we talked about the need for margin. We talked about the necessity of embracing limits in our lives, because embracing our limits allows us to see the awesome power and work of God in our lives. Now, this is not some sort of teaching on the prosperity gospel. This doesn't necessarily mean or imply that God is going to come and overwhelm us and make sure that everything in our life works out the way it's supposed to. That's not the point of this at all. The point is to say, God, we follow you and we agree with you that the way that you invade our lives is much better than the ways that we use to push you out. So last week we talked about that. If you missed that, you can find that on demand on our website. This week, the second week of our teaching series here on margin, we're going to talk about something pretty critical when we talk about margin. We're going to talk about time. We're going to talk about time. Now, before we do that, I want you to do something for me. If you can, go ahead and log into the chat right where you are. And I want you to do a couple things. First of all, introduce yourself, say hi, get to know the folks that are already there, the people that are already chatting. We got people from all over the world joining us in our worship services and the conversation. So enjoy that community right there. Go ahead and do that. If you have some questions about the conversation or about our church, go ahead and write those. That's the first thing. The second thing I want you to do while you're there is I want you to tell us the favorite ways you have to spend your time. What's your favorite way to spend time? What do you like to do the most? If you were given a bonus vacation week, what would you do? How would you spend that time? That's what I want you to write. So 2 things, introduce yourself and chat a little bit. And number 2, just tell us the favorite ways that you have to spend your time. What we're going to do today on the conversation is I want to show you a better way to view time. That's what we're going to do. We're going to get there in just a few minutes, so don't go anywhere. I wrote a list of a few things that we do with time other than spend it, right? Because that's what you're writing now. This is not an exhaustive list, but I think you kind of get the idea. We waste time, or maybe we don't waste it. Maybe other people waste our time. Maybe that's what it is. We lose track of time. We mismanage time, or maybe we don't mismanage time. Maybe it's the people we work with, right? Maybe it's their fault. Time gets away from us. We book our time. We schedule our time. We keep track of time. We tell time. We try to save time. There are other ways. I'm sure you probably got a few. We could probably spend the next few minutes trying to figure that out. But the point of that is that we spend a lot of our lives consumed with thinking about the time that we've been given. We realize that time is a limited commodity. We understand that. We know that there are 24 hours in a day. We realize the sun comes up and it goes down, and we know that once time passes, we can't get it back. We know that. We spend a lot of our time regretting things that we've done in our past, things that we wish we could go back and do. And we plan our time. We think ahead. We want to make sure that the mistakes we made early on in our lives, we don't make again. We spend all of our time thinking about time, what gets prioritized in the limited amount of time that we've been given. So we're going to talk about that today, and we're going to do that by first talking about time from the perspective of Moses. If you have your Bible, go ahead and turn to Psalm chapter 90. We're going to read that in just a minute. Moses wrote Psalm chapter 90, by the way. He is presented to us in Scripture as an authority on time. I want to share with you why that is. So essentially, you know the story of Moses. Moses lived his life in 4 acts, essentially 4 30 to 40 year increments. He was 120. He lived to be 120 years old. He lived longer than any of us probably will ever live, right? He lived 120 years, and he saw everything. So his life, the 4 stages of his life, give him an incredible perspective on the passage of time. Let's kind of talk about the 4 acts of his life for just a minute. You know the first act was lived in the household of Pharaoh. He was a prince of Egypt. He had everything that he could have ever wanted. He had resources at his fingertips, all the opportunities. His future was bright. Anything he could have ever wanted or dreamed of, he had whenever he wanted it. This was an amazing way to live, and he took advantage of that. But by the end of the first act of his life, he realized that the slaves that worked for his household were actually his people. And he was angered at the treatment of one of those slaves by an Egyptian guard, and he murdered the Egyptian guard. For his punishment, he was banished from Egypt, and he found himself in the next act of his life, act number 2, he found himself as a shepherd. Can you imagine the drastic change in the pace of life from being a prince of Egypt to being a shepherd? He lived the first act of his life in an accelerated pace. Anything he wanted, the sky's the limit. Life was never boring. To an extremely slow pace of life, a tedious pace of life, finding himself in the middle of fields with animals. It didn't smell good anymore. It was a tough life. He went from ease to tough. If we just stop there, we've got an amazing perspective on time from this person. But it doesn't just stop there, because the third act finds Moses back in Egypt. You know this story. God calls him to be the leader of his people as God delivers them from Egypt, from the hands of slavery, from the bonds of slavery. So he tasks Moses and Moses' brother Aaron to go back to Egypt to confront the Pharaoh and to demand that the Pharaoh let God's people go. But we also know in this story that God hardened Pharaoh's heart and caused Pharaoh to disregard this request. So God sends 10 plagues. You remember the story? And these 10 plagues were to force Pharaoh's hand to eventually make the decision to free these slaves. These were not good plagues. There's no such thing as a good plague, but these things were awful. They destroyed the economy, eventually destroying the lives of every Egyptian family. So the third act of Moses' life found him back in the very household that he left, probably knowing the Pharaoh and others in that household, to deliver in a very spectacular, tremendous fashion, to deliver the Hebrews from slavery. But the fourth act of his life went in a completely different direction, right? So you kind of imagine this glorious exodus for the people of God, but they were not a nice group of people. They were frustrated. And the Bible actually says that in some regards they wished for slavery over their newfound freedom. So what God does is he says, okay, we're going to let this entire generation of Hebrews die. You're never going to see the land that I promised you. Your children will, but you won't. And Moses, by the way, you're a part of this generation. You're going to die as well. So over the span of these 120 years, the 4 acts of his life, completely different perspectives, it gave Moses a perspective on time that was so valuable that God included it in the Bible. Let's read this. This is Psalm chapter 90. As we start, I want you to see how many times you can find the references to time in the text. We'll stop invariably to make some comments, but here we go. Psalm chapter 90, verse 1. Lord, you've been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you're God. In other words, you are the creator of all of these things. Of everything we see, God, you created it because you exist before. And you exist in eternity. In fact, you exist outside of time. You created this space for us to live. This is a great way to start any prayer. That's how Moses started. Let's keep going. Verse 3, you, God, you turn men back to dust, and you say, return to dust, O sons of men. In other words, God, you are involved in the ending of our time on earth. You're involved in that. We know that. We know that you are directly involved in the ending of our life. Let's keep going. Verse 4. For 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by. You know that. But you don't know the next part because we stopped there. Or, Moses writes, like a watch in the night. Don't take this literally, by the way. We've always assumed that a day is like 1,000 years, like a millennia to God. But Moses is saying that we can't fathom the way that you see time. If you can just say that we're just a bunch of particles of dust and that you decide, God, when we're over, then you must see time differently than us. 1,000 years are like a day, or it's like a watch in the night. A watch, by the way, is about a 3-hour span of time. So it gets a little crazier. Moses is saying 1,000 years is like 3 hours to you. It goes by so quickly. But even more than that, we don't understand how you see time, God. We can't fathom this. He keeps going. Verse 5, it's you who sweep men away in the sleep of death. You sweep them away. They're just dust. We're just dust. They're like the new grass of the morning. Though in the morning it springs up new, by evening it's dry and withered. Again, God, you are involved in the length of our lives. We might not understand how that happens, but you are, and you're directly involved in it. Listen to the lament. Verse 7, we're consumed by your anger and we're terrified by your indignation. We realize that we're nothing compared to you. You set our iniquities before us. You let us see our mistakes, our secret sins in the light of your presence. All of our days pass away under your wrath. We finish our years with a moan. You feel that way sometimes? Life's tough, isn't it? This is Moses' way of saying life is tough, God. We are well aware of our mistakes and our shortcomings. We see it. There's no way that can be hidden. And by the time that you sweep us away, that you command us to return to dust, we're exhausted. We end our days with a moan. Verse 10, the length of our days is 70 years or 80 if we have the strength, and we can even make it that long. Yet their span is but trouble and sorrow. You feel that way. We all feel that way. For they quickly pass. We fly away. We realize at the end of our life how quickly we experienced it. These are true words from a guy who lived to be 120. Verse 11, who knows the power of your anger? For your wrath is as great as the fear that is due you. In other words, if we could understand your power, our respect for you would grow immensely. But listen to verse 12. Listen to what Moses writes. Teach us, God, to number our days aright that we may gain a heart of wisdom. You know, this is a pretty incredible confession from a guy who lived to be 120, from a guy who watched his life be driven and dictated by God's plans for him. Moses writes, please teach us to get our time straight, to number our days correctly, to understand the passage of our own time. We don't have the capacity to do that. Verse 13, relent. Oh Lord, how long will it be? Have compassion on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love, that we may sing for joy and be glad all of our days. This is a remarkable confession that continues. We need you, God, to find joy in our lives. That's an amazing confession. You and I don't have the power to be joyous on our own because life is hard. Life is tough. The passage of time is difficult. So we pray to God, God, you've got to give us the ability to find joy here. Make us glad. Verse 15, for as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we've seen trouble. In other words, please equal the frustration and disappointment of our lives, God, with gladness and joy. All those days of frustration, balance those out with days of joy. May your deeds, verse 16, be shown to your servants in your splendor to their children. Verse 17, may the favor of the Lord our God rest upon us. Establish the work of our hands for us. Please, yes, Lord, establish the work of our hands. God is directly involved in the day-to-day operations of our life. Even though we schedule it, even though we put it on paper, even though we waste it, mismanagement, spend it, save it, whatever we do, God is directly involved in every second of our life that passes. And it would be incredibly foolish for us to think otherwise, to think that we are the people who can order and mastermind our own calendars. You and I can't do that. From a guy who lived to be 120, who lived 4 acts of his life, Egypt and back, into Egypt and back, this guy understood at the end of his life that every step that he had was a step of frustration that had to be counterbalanced with the joy that only God could give him, that could make him find the joy in the work of his own hands. This is powerful information in Psalm 90. Now, I told you as we started here that I'm going to show you a different way to view time. We can't adequately find margin in our lives. We can't find the space for faith to grow in our lives if we don't have an accurate view of time. This is how Moses viewed it, but it's built upon the foundation of what we're going to read next. And for this, we have to go to Genesis chapter 1. So, turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 1. We've referred to these chapters quite often here, or this chapter in this story, the creation story, quite often here in the conversation. We're going to do it again today. I want to show you why. Let's start reading Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. You probably have these memorized, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There's time there, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the earth was formless, and empty darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Now look at verse 3. And God said, "Let there be light." Let's keep going, because there's something here. And there was light. Verse 4, God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning. It was the first day. Did you know, you ever thought about this? That the very first thing God ever created, the very first thing God ever created was time. Everything else was created in time. So he had to create time first. Of all the things that God imagined for us to experience in our life, for all the creative actions that we read about in Genesis 1 and 2, the very first of those was the creation of time. But it gets even cooler than that. Later, at the end of these 7 days of creation, remember that? There are 7 days of creation. God says something remarkable about how he views these days. Listen to this. This is from Genesis chapter 2. It's the first couple of verses. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. And by the 7th day, God finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. Verse 3, and God blessed the 7th day. And get this, he made it holy. He made it special. He sanctified it, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. He enjoyed the previous 6 days. But the indicator here is that he called it, he made it holy. He sanctified it. That word there, that word holy or sanctified, from whatever translation you're reading, we don't see that word again until Exodus chapter 3, verse 5. It's in reference there to the very story that we just referenced earlier of Moses being called by God at the burning bush. Remember that story? God tells Moses to remove his shoes. You know why? Remember this? It's in Exodus chapter 3, verse 5. Because God said the ground upon which he was standing was holy. It was sanctified. So look at this, sort of theologically speaking. In Exodus chapter 1, we have an indication that time itself was created to be holy. God sanctified it. And later we find that there are actual spaces, geographical locations, that are also sanctified. And I told you I was going to encourage you, I was going to teach you a better way to see time. It's right here. Can you imagine what our calendars would look like if we saw time the way God did? God saw it as holy. He sanctified time. It was a special part of his creation. Can you imagine how we would spend our time if we adopted the very same way of viewing time that God did? What would happen if we started seeing each moment of our calendar, each hour of our calendar as sacred, as a sacred commodity, as a sacred passage of events and moments? Can you imagine that? Let's just kind of walk through that. So if you're still working, let's sort of assume that you're going to go to the office, or maybe you're going to work from home. How would your time be different in your occupation if you viewed each minute as holy? Let's go home. Maybe you have a family. How would your time be different if you viewed the time you spent with your family as holy? Or colleagues or friends? Or the times that you spent posting on social media? How would that change if the time that you spent in those activities was viewed the way God viewed time? As holy, as sanctified, as special. You know, we talked about this last week, but this idea of a holy day actually still continues. We read this from Hebrews chapter 4 last week. The writer of Hebrews conceptualized the idea of this seventh day of rest as continuing. That margin was built into the system on day 7. It was a day of rest. But this entire idea of time is completely viewed as holy. Now, let's kind of stop there for a minute, because I want you to think about something. We aren't alone in how we view the passage of time. Remember, I asked this question a little bit earlier. But let me kind of rephrase it now. So if we began to view every day as holy, as the passage of time as holy, what gets prioritized now? Right? What gets our chief attention if we view the time we've been given as holy? Not something to waste, not something to abuse, not something to mismanage, but as something to honor God, as something to be used to honor God. How would that change? How would that change? So what would we prioritize now? What would we prioritize in our schedules if we viewed the passage of time as holy? I'm going to tell you how Jesus currently views the passage of time. For this, we're going to go back to the New Testament book of Hebrews, and this time I want us to turn to Hebrews chapter 7. Hebrews chapter 7. Hebrews actually gives us a really great glimpse into the current day-to-day activities of Jesus. And you're probably saying, what are you talking about, right? Doesn't Jesus live in eternity? Isn't he with the Father? Yeah, he absolutely is. But we have to understand something. Jesus is a resurrected human being. The Bible's pretty clear on that. In the Gospels, he's a resurrected human. He can be felt and touched. He eats. You understand this, right? Later in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul talks about the resurrection body. It is going to be different, but it retains how we look. The essence of who we are may change, but our bodies are the same. Jesus was resurrected as a physical human being, right? And so when he leaves, we get the ascension at the end of the Gospel of Luke. He leaves as a human being, and so now he actually sits in the presence of God as a human being, right? We have that also in Hebrews. It's in Hebrews chapter 12. We also find it right here. So, as a human being, completely filled with God himself, because that's from Colossians, all the fullness of God was made and is made to dwell in Jesus. That's in chapter 1 of Colossians and chapter 2, past and present tense. Jesus actually spends his time in a certain few ways. I want you to listen to this. First of all, this is from Hebrews chapter 7. Listen to this. We're going to start reading in verse 23. Now there have been many of those high priests since death prevented them from continuing in office. But because Jesus lives forever, he's the great high priest. Because he lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him. Listen to how he spends his days. Because he always lives to intercede for them. In other words, Jesus is currently spending time interceding for me and you. His work of salvation is over. It's pretty clear here. So the second part of his existence right now in the presence of God is interceding for me and you. He is viewing time as a holy commodity, and he is interceding for us. Here's the next thing that he does. We're going to flip over to Hebrews chapter 10 for this, and I want us to scan down to verse 11. Listen to this. This is the second way Jesus spends his time. Day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties. Again and again, he offers the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But when this priest, Jesus, had offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, what did he do? He sat down at the right hand of God. And listen to this, verse 13. Since that time, he waits for his enemies to be made his footstool, because by one sacrifice he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. In other words, Jesus does two things. First, he intercedes for us. This is how he views currently, right now, he views time. He is spending his time doing two things: interceding for me and you, and waiting for the defeat of every enemy. The first fruits of all creation, right, is our leader in how to spend our time. If we're going to follow Jesus, we have to currently follow him like this. We see our time in two ways. Number one, just like Jesus, we are interceding in the world. We are ministers of reconciliation. This is not some pedantic idea of making sure everybody gets along. We are sharing the gospel, the life-saving, soul-saving message of the world. We are spending our time in whatever way it's planned, interceding, intervening, being ministers of reconciliation. And number two, we are waiting in holy anticipation, in a God-glorifying patience, with an absolute certainty that every enemy will be defeated. And we do that regardless of how our schedule is planned, regardless of whether or not it's an activity with friends, we're hanging out with people, right? Or we're working, or we're spending family time. Those two ways have to take precedence in how we view and spend time. If we do that, then we're going to find some spaces where our faith can grow. It's going to happen. And let me thank you for joining me here on The Conversation. I love this teaching series. This is week 2 of our teaching series called Margin. We're going to be back for week 3. I hope you join us right here again next Sunday. Thanks again for joining me today, and have a great day, everybody.